for joining us. This is the third session in our Brain Science Speaker Series. And the Brain Science Speaker Series is the inaugural event for LSU Mind. That's LSU's multidisciplinary Institute for Neuroscience Discovery. LSU Mind aims to coordinate and strengthen neuroscience, research, education, and community outreach here at LSU. I'm Melissa Beck, and I'm on the executive committee for LSU Mind, along with Steve Greening, Neil Donovan, Susan Duncan, and Harry Lewis. We'd like to thank the College of Humanities and Social Sciences and the Center for Computation and Technology for funding this speaker series. So today I get to introduce our speaker, our third speaker. We have three more this spring, so you can go to our webpage and learn about our other speakers. So our speaker for today is Dr. Ed O. Don't confuse him with the LSU football coach, Coach Ed O. So although Dr. Ed O may not be a local celebrity yet, maybe after today, but he was born in New Orleans, and he's a celebrity in the world of neuroscience. So Dr. O is coming to us from the University of Chicago, where he is a professor in the Department of Psychology and the Institute for Mind and Brain at the Department of Chicago. His research, which you'll learn some about today, focuses on working memory and attention. He's been very influential in this field. Of his many publications, 30 of them have been cited over 100 times. 12 of those have been cited over 500 times, and he has two that have been cited over 1,000 times. One's at like 1,400. So this means they're very influential in the field. So using neuroscience technique to look at the structure and function of working memory in humans is a relatively young science. But Dr. O has been making a significant contribution since the early 1990s and has helped get the field where it is today. In the early 1990s, he was one of the first to be working with neuroimaging techniques to study brain activation for spatial working memory. And since then, Dr. O has made numerous other contributions to the field. And today, we're fortunate enough to hear about some of those directly from Dr. O himself. So please join me in welcoming him today.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak here. It's a really cool opportunity and a format that I haven't participated in before, so I think this will be a lot of fun. And I'm also glad to be here because it happens to be approximately 80 degrees warmer than it was in Chicago about 2 weeks ago. The main thing that we have been studying in our lab, and that I've studied really since I started graduate school, is the construct of working memory. The idea of working memory is to focus on the small number of mental representations that you can actually hold in mind at any given moment. So if you've got an entire ocean of knowledge and memories and experiences stored away in your brain, then working memory refers to that which you are actually able to think about simultaneously at any given moment. And, if you're speaking loosely, then you can refer to this as conscious awareness, the information or ideas that are actually in mind at any given moment. And what I'm going to try to convince you of over the next half hour is that the scope of conscious awareness, the amount of information that you can hold in mind simultaneously, is actually much smaller than intuition would suggest. And I'll show you some objective studies that have been done to try to measure this in a rigorous fashion, and try to show you a little bit about the debate that has evolved on this question since the mid-90s or so. But really, it's something that's been of interest to scientists for centuries. And so the debate I'm referring to is just the one that I've sort of grown up with, starting from the latter years that I was a graduate student. So first, I would like to give credit where credit is due, and I've listed 2 other authors. There's actually an entire team of people behind the kind of work that we've been doing, but Kirsten Adam is a doctoral student who recently graduated from our lab and is now a postdoc at UC San Diego. And she's really the driving force behind the 2 studies that I'm going to talk to you about in some detail today. She came up with novel methods for asking these questions and brilliant ways of analyzing her data, and I can't give her enough credit for the kind of work that we're about to be discussing. And then, of course, my longtime colleague and collaborator and friend, Ed Vogel. So I think that one thing that makes this an interesting topic, especially for people that have not studied this before, is the fact that the limited scope of awareness is really quite counterintuitive when you compare it to what you might expect based on just your intuitions about what your experiences are like in everyday life. So for example, you could look around this room, or you could imagine the last time that you were in a beautiful scene or at a crowded carnival or whatever interesting or compelling visual environment that you can remember. And the subjective impression is that you've got this rich phenomenological experience with all sorts of ideas and sensory impressions that are in your mind simultaneously. And here's a quote from Emily Dickinson that kind of captures this idea that the space inside our mind and what we can think about is seemingly endless, right? The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one, the other will include with ease, and you besides. So your mind includes everything that you might be seeing and really gives you this rich landscape of information that's simultaneously available. Well, I'm here to tell you that this beautiful phrase is totally wrong. And that really what's going on here is that what we're aware of at any given moment is a very, very small subset of everything that is available in almost any normal environment, and that our intuitions are just a little bit misleading on this point, and that what you really need to do is to look at objective scientific evidence for what people are able to act upon or report, and suddenly what you'll find is that this information is much more limited than you might expect. So here's just one tiny subset of the many studies that have been run. In fact, in my undergraduate class this year, I talked about a study that was run in the late 1800s that was looking at a very similar question and came up with a very similar answer of about 3 or 4 things. So in this case, dating from George Sperling's classic studies on iconic memory, Hal Pashler's work with memory for letters, and then, most recently, well, only 20 years ago, work from Luck and Vogel that was a really seminal paper in this field. If you talk about citations, this one's got over 3,400 citations now. It's really spawned a cottage industry of work on this topic. And all of these different diverse approaches have come up with this relatively counterintuitive estimate, where if you boil down information to the simplest possible piece of information that you can conceive of, that people can only hold about 3 or 4 of those in mind simultaneously. Now, an important question that you might want to ask yourself as you hear me talking about this idea is, so why should we care about how many ideas I can hold simultaneously in mind? After all, I've got things that I can write things down on, and books, and a phone that got the world's knowledge on it. Well, one reason that we care about this is that it seems like it actually has an important impact on a wide range of intellectual abilities and cognitive functions that we do value in everyday life. So for example, if I were to measure how many colors that you could hold in short-term memory for just 1 second, something that we can measure in about 15 or 20 minutes pretty easily, what we find is that it's a great predictor of your IQ. So standard measures of fluid intelligence, your ability to handle novel situations and solve problems that you have not encountered before. You can predict a third to 40% of the variance across all individuals in their fluid intelligence just by looking at one of these simple colored square memory tests. It also predicts people's ability to succeed in college, It predicts people's ability to pay attention to the things that they're interested in while ignoring the things that they're not interested in. It predicts second language learning ability. It predicts career success. So there's a lot of evidence suggesting that these simple abilities that we've been studying in the laboratory are actually connected in a fundamental way to intelligent behaviors across a wide range of different contexts. All right, so with that as background, I thought I'd give you a quick memory test. So I'd like you to try to remember the colors that you're about to see in this demonstration video. So what's going to happen is that she's going to turn around this board. There's going to be some colors on that board. And your job will be to try to remember them as accurately as possible. Then it'll be turned around and then revealed once again. And your question to answer is whether or not these colors have changed in the meantime. Let's see. Trying to find my cursor on this. Whoops. Can't seem to find my cursor. Usually, if I go to the, oh, there it is. All right, ready? Here we go. I hope. Please. Let's see. I'm gonna try to quickly jury rig this. There we go. Okay, what do you think? Has anything changed? Yes. And what is it? The answer is that this square here is a slightly different shade of red than it was the first time. So if you caught that, that means you have a pretty precise memory. Now I'm going to give you one more chance at this task. And the reason that we might want to try this again is because really, what I was emphasizing is that performance on this task taps into intellectual ability in interesting ways. But really, to understand that or to really measure that properly, you have to give people more than 3 colors. 3 is not hard enough to really tap into the ability that we're interested in. So I'm going to give you a somewhat more challenging version here. And so try your hardest now to remember everything and see if anything changes. Ready? All right, what do you think? Anybody want to give me a suggestion? I've heard somebody say no change. Usually I have the green, somebody says the gray one. I'm not, there aren't any gray squares there, so I'm a little confused by that. So I've shown this video to many audiences, and ones as large as 300-400 people, and often I get a lot of suggestions about which color might have changed, and of course, well, not of course, but let me just tell you now that any suggestion of that kind is wrong because all the colors are the same. However, I'd like to introduce you to some folks. This is Arita Mance. She was a graduate student in our laboratory for some time, and she's now working at Apple, working on helping with different interfaces and getting smartwatches to work to do the kinds of things, tracking things that you want to be able to do. And this is Kirsten Adam, totally different person. She's got, you might notice she has blonde instead of brown hair. She's about 6 inches shorter, is wearing a different shirt. I've shown this to maybe 1,000 people by now, and I've only had several people ever notice this change in the person that was actually revealing these colors. And essentially what I'm using this to demonstrate is that when your mind is focused on one thing, then even things that you are looking directly at can completely fail to be registered in your awareness. And this is perhaps one reason why you should consider why it is a terrible idea to ever talk on the phone or text while driving, because essentially what you're doing is taking your mind to a different part of the world and not paying attention to the things right in front of you. So this is another way to dramatically illustrate that even things that you would think would be really obvious and salient to a visual scene are completely absent from your mind if the limited focus of your attention is diverted to some other location. All right, now let's go back to our full screen. And I can now move on to show you what happens when we look at this in a less fanciful but more rigorous experimental task. And this is the classic paper from Luck and Vogel in 1997. And they essentially popularized this now benchmark kind of measure of short-term memory capacity. And the way they ran this task was first to present an array of simple colored squares, all of which were extremely different from each other. So no subtle kind of visual analysis is required to see what is in front of you on the screen. There was a blank delay period where the squares were removed from the scene for less than a second, for about 9/10 of a second only. At the end of that 9/10 of a second, another array of squares was presented, and the job was for subjects to indicate whether any of the squares had changed their color in that 1 second gap. Okay? So in this case, the green square on the bottom right has changed to the color white. Now what they did was to run this memory task and to manipulate the number of squares that were in the display in an attempt to figure out how many colors people could handle at one time. And here are their data here. On the x-axis, we've got the number of squares that was in the display. And on the y-axis, we've got accuracy, with 100% perfect being here at the top of the scale. And so what you see, of course, is that with one item, they're basically perfect. With two items, they're perfect. With three items, they're just about perfect. There's just a couple of mistakes happening. But now, right after three items, there's actually a quite much more substantial drop in accuracy just by adding that fourth item to the screen. If you go from 4 items to 8 items, now you've plummeted down about a good 40% in accuracy already, and you continue downward the more and more items you add into the screen. And if we look at this and we analyze these data as a function of how many colored squares are presented, we can calculate the approximate number of colors that an individual must have been able to store in memory to achieve whatever accuracy they achieved at that particular set size. And the interesting result, which came as a surprise even to visual scientists and memory scientists in the late 90s, is that the average person can store only about 3 or 4 of these simple colors in mind for less than 1 second. All right, so this was a really interesting and striking discovery that they made, and it kind of spawned an entire domain of the literature where people are trying to kind of understand the nature of this measure and understand what it reveals about the limitations in short-term memory. But I want to emphasize one interesting ambiguity that is present in our interpretation of this result that you see right here. And in particular, we can point out that the mistakes that we see growing in frequency as we increase the number of squares in the display could be because of a failure to store the item that changed in the display. In other words, maybe they're limited to storing 3 or 4 of these squares, and the other squares are not stored at all. If one of those squares were to change, you wouldn't notice the change because it wasn't even in your mind at all, right? So that's what we'll call the storage failure hypothesis. And it's sort of the one that I've been endorsing in the way that I've been talking about these data. But on the other hand, another possibility is that they did store all 8 items in this display, but because there were so many items, they had a relatively poor quality of memory for each of those colors that they were holding in mind. And therefore, when a color changed, say from green to white, perhaps the reason they missed that change was not because there was nothing in memory for that particular item, but that the quality of the memory was not sufficient for them to detect the difference between the initial square's color and the color that it had changed to, right? So in this case, the critical point about this second hypothesis is that it is one where you could assume that all items were stored at least to some degree, right? Whereas the first hypothesis is arguing only 3 or 4 of these items are stored to any degree, and the rest of the items are left behind entirely, okay? And what we've been interested in over this 20 years in large part has been a debate in which we try to understand the currency of this memory system. What is the limiting factor for your ability to store this information? Is it the number of things that you can be accountable for? Or is it the quality of the information that you have about the many things that you're storing in memory at the same time? Now, interestingly, from the same laboratory of Steve Luck with his brilliant student Wei-Wei Zhang, about 10 years later, in 2008, they came up with another behavioral experiment that actually did produce some really beautiful evidence that I think was compelling in trying to discern between those two hypotheses that I was just laying out for you in the last slide. So it's a very similar kind of task. They were presented to subjects a handful of colors to remember, and then at the end, they were asked to report the exact color of one of the items that had been presented in that display. So just like in the task that I showed you, they're trying to remember some varying number of colors in working memory, but the difference is that at the end now, they're recalling the exact color instead of trying to detect a change in that color. And in this case, here when they are cued by the bold-faced box in this location, then they know that they should be trying to recall that exact color. And the way they would do that is by taking their mouse and clicking right about here on this color ring to indicate the exact color that they remembered from that display at the beginning of the trial. And they had a really beautiful insight about how these data could be analyzed to answer that mystery that I was posing in the last slide. Because I should point out that actually this continuous report task had been in the literature for some time already. And indeed, people had used continuous report for decades before this experiment was published. So the really amazing thing that they did was to realize that there was a way to analyze these data to answer this question. And here was their insight. What they realized was that if people ever do fail to store items completely from the displays, that there should be 2 types of answers that people will give to this color question at the end of this 1-second delay period. If the item was in memory, and that's shown here in this blue dashed line, and here what I'll point out is that on this x-axis is all the possible color values that they could have reported at the end of the trial, with the exact perfect answer being lined up with the 180-degree point in the center of the x-axis. So they reasoned, if subjects have the color that we're asking them about in memory, then the answer they give should actually fall somewhere close to this perfect 180-degree position on the x-axis. Of course, even if you're looking directly at a color and reporting it without it disappearing, you're not going to be perfect in your click, right? Everybody's got a little bit of fuzziness in their vision. And of course, in memory, there's even more fuzziness. And so what they expected reasonably was that all of the correct answers, all the answers for items that were in memory would not fall exactly at 180 degrees, but there would be a distribution of answers that would be centered at 180 degrees, and that would spread outward some distance from there. And this is just a way to point out that memory is not perfect, right? On the other hand, what if the subject was asked about a color that they did not store in memory, that they completely failed to store? Then what is the most likely answer that they will give to this question? Well, if I ask you what color is the car that I drove in high school, your answer would basically be random, right? Because none of you have any idea that I drove a really beat up, terrible Chevette, and it was red. So what happens then is that the answers that people give, if items are not in memory at all, they're complete guesses. And therefore, the distance that any given answer falls from this correct 180-degree mark is going to be completely random and equiprobable at any position on the color scale. Some of those answers will be over the perfect, just because they got lucky, they'll be over the correct answer. Some of those answers will be 90 degrees away, as far away as you can get in color space. But the idea is that none of these particular answers should be any more likely than any of the other answers, because they're all complete guesses, right? Therefore, this should lead to a completely uniform, flat distribution of answers across all possible color values. So, by the way, the x-axis here is representing the frequency of responses. So if you ask somebody about a color that was not stored in memory, we should get this flat distribution of responses that has no relationship to the stored item at all. And indeed, what they found in their own data when they collected these data is that what they saw in the error distribution was beautifully described by a combination of in-memory and not in-memory answers in the behavioral responses of these subjects. And so that produced positive, compelling evidence that subjects completely failed to store, in this case, approximately 3 out of 6 simple colors that were presented to them only 1 second before they were asked to recall the color of one of those items. So this was a really important theoretical step because it gave us positive evidence for complete failure to store more than about 3 items from these displays. And that tells us something important about the currency of memory. It seems to be that the currency is item-based and not just information-based. It's not just that people store a tiny bit of as many things as they want. They, in fact, are limited in the number of things that they can actually encompass within this online short-term memory system. Well, you know, one thing about scientists is that they really have trouble letting go of debates. And so maybe you won't be surprised to hear that that brilliant study that I just presented to you from Zhang and Luck did not resolve this controversy in the literature. And I'm going to tell you another story now about a challenge to the interpretation that I just gave you. And this is the challenge that Kirsten Adam took on in the project of hers that I'm going to present to you. So I'm going to tell you about 2 alternative explanations of the data that I just presented to you from Zhang and Luck. On the one hand, we've got the idea that is pretty much in line with Zhang and Luck's conception, that sometimes people are completely guessing in this task, leading to this uniform, flat distribution of responses. Other times, they actually know something about the answer, and so they give you a color that is centered on the correct answer, but it's got some spread. Another refinement of the model that you can see in the picture here on the left is that now you see that we've got actually a range of different distributions associated with these target answers. With answers when they know the color, sometimes they're really precise and you get a very tight distribution right around the correct answer. Sometimes they're a little bit less precise, so you get a somewhat wider distribution. This is just to acknowledge what we've realized over the years is that indeed your memory for colors and orientations and shapes, it's not always the same. If you store 3 things in memory, one of those memories is probably better than some of the other memories. And this is what we call variable precision. It's just the idea that memories are kind of diverse in their quality. And so to understand these data the best, we need to take into account that variable precision of the memories that people store. But over here, we've got a very different conception in which what scientists did, and this was work from the laboratory of Weizhi Ma at New York University, what they did was to instead take this idea to its extreme and argue that, well, yeah, there is variable precision of memories, but actually, sometimes the memories are really bad. You've got super fuzzy memories that are stored, and if you make that assumption that there can be wide variation in the quality of memories in this task, you can actually model the exact same error distribution that Zhang and Luck discovered, but you can do it while assuming that every single item in the display is stored. And so we started to have a battle in the literature between these 2 different types of memory hypotheses. One in which only a small subset of the items were stored and the rest were completely lost. And another in which every item in the display was stored, no matter how many items were presented, but that there was variable precision between those memories. And there were papers published, and some of them I'm on, in which essentially these models fight to a tie. They're in a battle to the death, and they fight to a tie, right? And we were essentially at a deadlock in this literature, and maybe we were almost ready to move on. And this was when Kirsten Adam entered graduate school. Okay, she developed a new task, a new way of doing this kind of experiment. And it's actually very similar to what you just saw, but there are a couple of really important differences. I'm going to focus on one of these because we've got limited time today. So in her task, subjects saw, once again, some number of colored squares. It actually varied from as few as 1 to as many as 6 colors, like you see in this display here. And then after a 1-second delay period, just like in the Zhang and Luck task, they recalled these colors. But the key difference is that in Kirsten's task, she actually had them recall every single item in the display. Not just one of the items, but in this case, all 6 items. They produced an answer for them one at a time. And they did that in whatever order they wanted to answer the question in. So they reported whatever item they wanted to first, and then they cycled through until they had provided a color answer for every item in the display. So what did she find in this experiment? Well, the first item that they presented, or that the subjects recalled, they recalled it beautifully. They had almost no guessing at all in their first response, and they had a very precise recall of the color. She also did this with orientation, by the way, so she's replicated this multiple times with different types of features. The second response, also quite accurate. Third response, pretty accurate, but now we're starting to see some hints that there is this flat distribution starting to emerge, suggesting that there is some probability of guessing in this display. And now, what happens for the 4th, 5th, and 6th answers is that suddenly what you see is that essentially we're getting entirely flat distributions for those items. Indeed, if we take these last couple of responses, what we see is that the best model for explaining the shape of the distribution that you have here is one that assumes that it is a completely uniform, flat distribution with no information about the target. And if you're into modeling, it's important to know that this model has 0 degrees of freedom, essentially. What you do is you say, how many trials were there in this experiment? OK, I'm going to generate that many random answers, and that's the shape you're going to get. That is the best way to describe the data that came out of Kirsten's experiment. And so now, that model deadlock that I was talking to you about was actually broken by this simple experiment, where suddenly we get beautiful statistical evidence of guessing for most subjects for 3 out of the 6 items that were presented. And this was just a beautiful piece of experimental design and also analytic work, because Kirsten figured out that you should ask people to respond in whatever order they wanted, and that you should analyze each of those responses separately from one another. And that's what revealed this really clear empirical pattern in these data. So to summarize, precision declined systematically with each response that subjects made in order. After 3 responses, there's virtually no evidence of any knowledge of the color or orientation that was being presented. And if we do fancy model comparisons, what we show is that the majority of subjects have completely random guesses for the last 3 responses in this display. OK, now, if you happen to be somebody that studies cognitive psychology, then you should be raising a concern right now about something that we call output interference. If I ask you to tell me about all the people that were at the party that you were at last night, well, what happens is that you'll quickly be able to name a few people, but we can demonstrate scientifically that actually naming off those first few people will interfere with your ability to retrieve the information about other people that you might have remembered if you hadn't been blabbing about the other people that you probably spent more time with, right? That's called output interference. So we need to worry about whether Kirsten's effects here might reflect output interference. Maybe they would have been OK over here if they hadn't already had to make these other responses to the display. And so what she did to test this hypothesis was to run another condition in which the computer told the subject which items to report when. So now the subject can't tell you which item is their favorite or report it first. And we can ask, if this is a function of output interference, what we should see is a very similar decline in performance as we go from response 1 to response 6. And that's not what happened. We actually do see a reliable decline from response 1 to response 2. It's pretty modest. But then after that, flat. In other words, all the error distributions look very similar, and they could all be modeled by a model in which people remember about half the time, about 3 out of 6 times, they will remember the color that you were asking them about at that click. So these data do a nice job of ruling out output interference as a main driving force of the evidence for guessing that Kirsten produced in that original procedure. So I just think this is a really beautiful piece of work. It's an entirely behavioral project, but it is one that is a foundational study for a lot of the neural studies that we are now conducting to understand memory limits and attention limits in humans. All right, now just going back to that debate I was telling you about with the deadlocked models fighting to the death. Well, it's really interesting to point out at this point that we've learned something interesting about the competitor model from the study that Kirsten did. If we take those variable precision models that denied any guessing in these kinds of tasks, and we show them all the data from the experiment that I just showed you, but instead of splitting it up into 6 responses, we just put it in all one big pile, sort of like Zhang and Lux experiments did. One thing that's really important to notice is that these variable precision models that deny guessing, they produce a beautiful, almost perfect fit to the aggregate data from that experiment. And so you now see why there was this difficult competition between these models, because the variable precision models that are denying any kind of guessing or storage failures, they're able to fit these distributions in a really powerful and accurate way. And what Kirsten did was to figure out why that is the case. And this was something that people had not understood for the first 6 years after these variable precision models came onto the scene. What she figured out is that actually, while those models say that there are no guesses at all in these memory experiments, what they were doing was calling things that are guesses memories. They told you that they were memories, but actually they were guesses in disguise. And I want to try to give you an intuitive understanding of what that means with the next couple of slides. So here's one way to think about this. If we take these variable precision models that deny guessing, and we actually consider what would happen if we ran the exact same procedure that Kirsten ran, what kinds of predictions would these variable precision models make about the quality of the memories that people have for these 6 non-guesses that they are proposing in this experiment? Well, here's one way to think about it. How bad would the worst 1/6 of the memories be according to the models that say all 6 items are stored? That's the question that I'd like to ask. All right, so here's one way to illustrate this. This is the Burj Khalifa. It's currently the tallest building in the world at 829 meters tall. If you've ever stood near this building, it's totally cool. You feel really small. It's got LEDs all over it. It's got amazing light shows, but I digress. If the best recalled item in Kirsten's experiment was the Burj Khalifa at 829 meters tall, then how tall would the worst recalled item be according to the model that says there's no guessing? You might try to come up with a guess. 48 meters tall? I mean, is that even a building? Yeah, actually, that's still pretty tall, but it's not 48 meters, actually. It's 0.48, and it's not meters, actually. It's millimeters. So according to the models that say there is no guessing in these experiments, the worst memories, 1 out of 6 memories, is approximately the height of 5 sheets of paper stacked on top of each other compared to the tallest building in the world. Here's another way to ask this question. What Kirsten did in this clever simulation analysis was to look at the question of how many pieces of data, how many trials of data would you require in this experiment to tell the difference between one of these so-called memories and a completely random guess. And here she's really giving an advantage to getting the smallest number by using simulated data that were completely noise-free, which no scientist can actually get in their lab, but we're just going to go with the noise-free paradigm for the moment. The first 3 responses that you saw, which as I pointed out are fairly accurate and doesn't have that much evidence of guessing, it would take fewer than 10 trials of noise-free data to tell the difference between those responses and a completely random guess. how many would it take to distinguish the sixth worst memory, according to the no guessing model, from completely random noise? Well, the answer is 927 billion tries. So basically, if you go back to the first experimental psychology lab founded by William Wundt, and you ran a subject every day, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day with no breaks, something you could never get by my IRB panel, actually you'd still have about 50 years to go to complete this experiment. And basically, it comes out in the end to be 53 million years of continuous runtime in a typical experiment of this kind. And essentially what I'm trying to convince you of is that while these models claim that there were no guesses in these data, in fact, what they're calling memories are literally undetectable by any known method to man, right? Therefore, I think if we think about this metaphor that people often use for memory, this is one way that they've often portrayed the debate between a model that I've been endorsing today, where if you give people 6 things, they've got some information about 3 of those things. They've basically got no information about the other 3 things, because the currency of memory is the number of things that you can hold in mind. The competitor model has often been called the variable precision model, even though both models actually acknowledge variable precision. And it's often portrayed with cartoons like this, where you see wide variation in the quality of the memories, but where there is some liquid in all 6 of the glasses. But it turns out that if you actually represent the amount of liquid that is proposed by the model itself, that the accurate picture for the variable precision model is also 3 glasses where there is no detectable liquid here. I actually thought about going to my colleague's wet lab and using her micro pipette to fill a glass with the amount of water that would actually be in there. But I realized that it's completely, you can't see anything. It doesn't actually show anything. And so this is really the cartoon that should have been used to portray this debate in the first place, in which case I think people would have reasonably said, why are we having this debate, right? This is not useful. All right, so maybe I've convinced you now that there is such a thing as guessing in these kinds of tasks, that people do fail to store more than about 3 things in these experiments. But actually, there is yet another way for us to try to wriggle out of that kind of interpretation. So there are 2 ways that we could explain guessing in this model. And the last thing I'm going to show you briefly is an experiment where we've tried to tell the difference between these 2 explanations. I see that I've actually used up way more than 30 minutes at this point. Like, is this a problem? Or should I push the fast forward button a little bit?
Keep going.
I'll just keep going. Okay, so on the one hand, it could be that subjects actually did store all the items, but they guessed because they had trouble retrieving that information to guide the response that we asked them to make at the end of the experiment. So this is a case where they might have brain activity that represented all the items, but that they had trouble working with all 6 of those representations. That's kind of the idea. And there are recent papers laying out a good case for why this kind of retrieval interference may be important in these tasks. Alternatively, maybe it's what I said. It's that some items were never stored, and that's why you had nothing to retrieve at the end of the experiment. So the last thing I'm going to show you is an experiment, another one that Kirsten has been leading, where we are trying to decode memory representations using the electrical activity that comes from the brain. And we do this with EEG recordings. So essentially, in these experiments, we've got 10 electrodes on the scalp of the subjects. And we are measuring rhythmic brain activity that is coming from the brains of these subjects with these electrodes. And the simple summary of what we can do is that if we look at the pattern of that rhythmic brain activity on the scalp, the cool thing that we discovered about 5 or 6 years ago is that depending on which location a person is holding in memory, the pattern of that activity on the scalp is different. If they're remembering this location here, you get a different pattern of scalp activity than if they're remembering a location in another part of the screen. So essentially, just by measuring the electrical activity in the brain, we can decode what positions that person is thinking about in the experiment. And the cool thing about that is we can do it before they have to make any kind of response. Before they have to engage in any kind of retrieval, we can now measure with this electrical activity what positions they actually have in mind. And when we do that, we get data that look kind of like this, where we have on the x-axis here the different types of spatial locations that might have been represented in the brain. So these are all the positions around the circle in this spatial memory task that you see on the left. And what we see is that the activity that corresponds to the remembered location is the highest, and we get a graded drop-off in activity as we move to locations further and further away from that remembered position. This is a really cool way that you can kind of read somebody's mind by using the electrical activity that is visible on their scalp with the right recording equipment. Now, one way that we can measure the amount of information in this neural signal is by measuring the slope of the decline from the position they're holding in memory across the positions that they are further and further away. So the steeper this slope is, the more information there is about the item that is in memory. So I'm going to use that memory slope, and here's a way that you would look at these data if we're just plotting slope on the y-axis. The item is presented to be remembered. The slope rises up within the first 100 milliseconds. And for the rest of the trial, here a 2-second trial, we see that there's this sustained spatial signal that tells us exactly which position they're holding in memory during that trial. So now what I'm going to do is show you an ambitious experiment that Kirsten ran in which she did this for trials in which people were attempting to remember 6 items at a time. Here's what she saw when they had only 1 item in memory. Here's what she saw when she tried to model the position of a completely random position that was not actually presented to the subject. This is just a sanity check for us, right? We want to make sure that we're not going to get positive information about stuff that doesn't exist, right? Here's the first item that they saw, the second, and the third. So what you see is that we get positive activity that is all higher than what we would get if it was a random piece of information. And that's 1, 2, and 3 items. But for 4, 5, and 6, we got no above chance activity for those items. So what I'm trying to tell you much too quickly is that if you try to use electrical activity to track the locations people are thinking about, before they have to make any kind of behavioral response or retrieval operation, we can track 3 of those items, and we have no evidence that we can track the remaining 3 out of 6 items in that display. This gives us some further evidence that it really is a failure of storage, and not just a failure of working with the information that they had stored in the first place. All right, so give people the simplest pieces of information that you can conjure. They can store about 3 out of 6 of those things. Models that deny guessing are sophisticated and produce beautiful fits to the same data sets, but the way they do so is by mimicking the effects of guessing with memories that are so impossibly fuzzy that they literally can't be detected. And finally, if we look at rhythmic brain activity, I'm calling it alpha activity because that is the particular name for the frequency of activity that we were focused on. What we see is that we get evidence for only 3 out of 6 items stored, suggesting that these guesses really are due to failures of storage of these items. And so, therefore, it makes sense for us to distinguish between the number of things people can store and the quality of the representations that they have of those items. And we think this is a productive way for us to try to understand the fundamental limits in our awareness of the world around us. All right, thank you very much.
Asking Dr. O a couple questions, and then I'll open it up to the audience to ask questions. Okay, so that was really interesting. Thank you. I'm particularly interested in this ability to measure alpha waves to determine the spatial location that somebody's holding in memory. And I'm thinking of it particularly historically in the context of where the neuroscience was in the early 1990s when you started using PET scans to see what areas of the brain were active, till now, and how the technology has improved our ability to ask different kinds of questions, and what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, there was a huge surge of interest and energy around human neuroscience started in the 90s when they developed non-invasive techniques for looking at human brain activity. Because before that, all of our information about human brain function came from very rare studies, usually in epileptic patients where there were electrodes inserted inside the skull of humans, or maybe from neuropsychological incidents where people had brain damage. And you could make some inferences about how the brain's different areas contributed to functions based on those cases, but it was very limited. And so when we could now do studies of regular old college students who are healthy and understand which parts of their brain were more active in positron emission tomography or now in functional MRI studies, people became a lot more excited about trying to localize and understand neural circuits. Of course, EEG studies were also already going on for a couple of decades at this point, but they just didn't quite capture the imagination of scientists as much as the advent of these sort of tomographic imaging approaches that people developed in the 90s. Whether that was appropriate or wise is another debate that I won't get into. And I think that a really interesting development in that technology, is that in the 90s, while we were focused on which parts of the brain are more active when people are remembering things or paying attention or feeling happy or feeling sad, now what we can do is we can do studies kind of like the one that I told you about at the end, where instead of just asking how much brain activity there is, we can now try to understand what the brain activity is representing. So we can go into specific brain regions and look and say, this person is currently thinking about the color green. This person is currently thinking about a face instead of a place. This person is thinking about a high number instead of a low number. So it's a completely different class of questions that you can ask about this neural activity that goes beyond a pure localization approach to this kind of research. And I think both approaches are important, but that pattern classification approach of getting the information out is a really important and compelling new dimension to the work that we can do. And for me, it really renewed my interest in using those techniques.
So another question I have is about the sensory specificity of this. So a lot of your research has to do with representing visual information. And so when you talk about a limit in how much information I can be aware of or conscious of in a given moment, is that limit specific to visual information, or is the three items also, if I'm trying to think of a note in a song and a color, are these occupying the same resources, do you think?
Right. So another way to put that question is, if I've got three spaces for information in my mind, then if I remember a sound, does that use one of them up? Or do I still have three spaces left for colored squares or whatever it might be? And I'll say to start off with that I'm not sure what the answer is. But I think that there's a plausible story to be told that really there is kind of a central limit in awareness, and that it really, to be more nuanced about our definitions, what I would say is that even in the visual domain, we have to be careful to specify that the limit of 3 refers to how many distinct, let's say, individuated representations are in mind. So, for example, I could show you an American flag, a banana, and a horse, and you'll be able to remember all of them, even though each of them actually has, an American flag has 3 colors, and a horse has a bunch of details in it, and people will be able to do pretty well on that memory task. What I would say is the reason they can do well is because they have long-term memories that allow them to summarize those objects, and they're just 3 ideas, essentially, 3 distinct ideas. To get to the details inside one of those items, they have to kind of unpack them, and that actually requires an active, effortful process. So that's still 3 things, even though eventually you could dig out a lot more than 3 pieces of information out of that. All right, so now we go into the auditory domain with a note. Well, you could also remember the entire Happy Birthday song, right? But is that one thing, or is it all the notes that are in that song? I'd say it's probably one thing if you're just thinking about it as the idea of that song. All right, so suppose we have all that controlled, and now we have 1 auditory idea and 2 visual ideas. then the 3-slot hypothesis would be that, yeah, you're actually done now. You're full of all the information you can hold. And we've tried to test that in our lab, and we don't find evidence of that. When we give people an auditory thing and a visual thing, they don't seem to compete with each other in the same way that two visual things do. On the other hand, there's other experiments that have been done from Nelson Cowan's lab, for example, where they did in fact find what looked like direct competition between auditory and visual memories. So I guess what I'd say is that the empirical landscape is mixed. It could be that we just don't have the right designs yet of our experiments, that we didn't succeed in getting people to treat them as individuated items. Like, what if you were trying to remember a horse that was coughing? Well, that's a sound and a visual thing. I mean, like, there's all sorts of bizarre alternative stories we could make. And so I'm not confident in our null result. And I'm interested by people who have found what looks like competition between them. And I don't really know what the answer is.
I have one more question, and I'll let you all ask some questions. So I always wonder when I read these kind of studies and do some similar kind of research myself, the extent to which the findings are based on encoding strategies instead of maintenance limits. So in doing a task with 8 colored squares, I can kind of learn over time that I can't, let's assume for a minute that's resources, right, the resource model, that I really can't hold those 8 representations at a high enough precision to do well, so I'm going to abandon that strategy. I could do it if I wanted to, but I'm going to choose not to because it seems like I have more success if I allocate my attention or my resources to 3 items more completely.
Yeah.
And so how do you rule out just a encoding strategy mechanism to account for the results?
I'm not sure that the extant data can completely rule out that strategy. I think it is sort of a numerological fascination that it always ends up being 3 things, even if it's faces or simple colored squares or tracking moving dots. And I just wonder, like, why do people always pick that number if there's no actual structural limit in the memory system? You get similar limits when people are monitoring visible things and trying to keep their attention locked onto them at the same time as when they're trying to remember information that is no longer visually present. And neural activity also that is load sensitive, that tells you how many things are in memory. That neural activity also seems to reach a plateau at about 3. But to be honest, I think that is potentially, that's still consistent with your alternative explanation that people are simply choosing not to remember that information. Now, there was one published study from Zhang and Luck, again, who, what they did was to pay people to try to motivate them to remember as many items as they could. So what they told them was, all right, in this condition of the experiment, we will pay you this much to have 3 precise memories. But in this condition of the experiment, we'll pay you much more to have really bad memories of 4 or 5 things instead of just 3 things. To go ahead and have really fuzzy memories, but as long as you have any information at all, you'll make more cash, which is, by the way, the best way to motivate undergraduates. And subjects couldn't do it. They were not able to choose in that experiment to have fuzzy memories of more things. So that suggests that it's not just a strategic choice, but I think it's just one study too. So I feel like we have to be open to the idea that something about what you said is still plausible. So I think more work is needed.
Does anyone have a question?
My interest is actually in the artificial intelligence system development. I have a couple of questions. So the first question is, in your experiment, I wonder there is actually the role of long-term memory. And I wonder, you can completely remove the influence of long-term memory. Otherwise, you cannot say this is just intellectual, right? This is just a physical response. The second question, which is more important for me, is why the limitation of working memory exists? Is that because no need from the evolutionary perspective, or something like more important forgetting mechanism or reasoning mechanism is needed to manage this kind of working memory function?
Yeah, those are both really good questions. So the role of long-term memory actually is something that we've thought about for a long time, and I think it's something that hasn't been thought about enough by scientists doing the genre of work that I presented to you. So often what you'll see is implicit reasoning in the papers that are published, where they're using a working memory task, and they assume that any information that subjects have at the end of a short delay period must be evidence of being stored in working memory. Whereas in fact, we know that I could show you a shape. You might be distracted by something your friend says for a moment. That shape has left your mind momentarily, and that you'd be able to probably retrieve it and bring it back to mind, right? So we know that long-term memory forms snapshots of every experience that we have, and that if there's not too much interference, we'll be able to retrieve that information at a later point in time. So I think that you're absolutely right that long-term memory could contribute, theoretically, in all of these types of behavioral experiments that I've shown you. Now, on the other hand, we also know something about the neural mechanisms for long-term memory and working memory, where long-term memory is a passive storage kind of system having to do with potentiation of connections between different neural ensembles in the brain. It's a passive sort of static storage system. So if I see active neural signals that track the information that the person is trying to hold in working memory, to me that is beautiful positive evidence that it is a working memory. So the fact that we see a correspondence between those load-sensitive neural signals and behavioral performance in well-designed tasks makes me more confident that what we're tracking with those behavioral experiments is in fact working memory. I think the neural data actually is a critical way to converge on that conclusion. Now the other question you asked is a really big one that I don't know the answer to. I mean, is a 3-item limit somehow adaptive? I think that's what you're asking, right? Is there some engineering reason why evolution would have led to a system that has this kind of critical limit? And I don't really have a great answer for it. I think what we want here is, well, what might provide some more insight is if we had a better mechanistic neural model of why these limits are happening. There's one idea that's been around since the 90s where they talk about, I was looking at brain rhythmic activity. And one idea is that when you're representing, let's say, a color in memory, the way you're doing that is with a population code of color-sensitive cells in your visual system, right? So I'm thinking of red, all the cells that represent red, it's a population of millions of cells, and that population is kind of rhythmically on and off. It's going on and off in a fluctuating rhythmic fashion. Now, one question you can ask is, what if I'm also remembering a green thing? How is it that the red and the green memories don't get mixed up together in my mind? Well, one hypothesis is the reason they don't get mixed up is because they have different rhythms. They're offset from each other, so that you can, by having different phases of the rhythmic activity, you can keep them segregated in mind. So one reason for the limit might be that you've only got so much space in the rhythms, that after a while there's too many random coincidences in the rhythms and they start to interfere with each other. Therefore, keeping it down to a small number allows you to have these discrete representations without having them catastrophically interfere with each other. It's a beautiful and very poorly supported by data hypothesis. So it's just a beautiful model published in Science. People have been looking for evidence for this for decades, and there's like a little bit of evidence that sort of goes in that direction, which gets published in high-profile papers, but then it's not going much further yet. So I have a healthy grain of salt in my mind about that hypothesis, but it's one of the best ones that we've got. There's also some ones that look at bump attractor kind of states, like other states where patterns of neural activity are recurrent, and that they kind of, if there's too many of them, they get sucked into each other. So it's kind of like the idea is that they interfere with each other, neurally or computationally. So that's kind of the gist of some of the ideas that are out there.
This is actually just following up on exactly the thread that you're on right now, so this is great. the alpha band EEG ability to decode between different positions. I was hoping you could say a little bit more about what you think that means about the representation, that you can decode it in temporal frequency without being able to do very much spatial resolution. So the fact that you can decode all these different directions from this temporal domain that has really low spatial resolution, what does that tell you about how working memory is working in your brain?
Well, keep in mind that what we're decoding here is spatial position.
Yes.
And
Right.
so the cool thing about spatial position, conveniently, is that there are these topographic maps in the brain of space. So the right hemisphere of the brain processes locations in the left visual field. The left hemisphere of the brain processes locations that are in the right visual field. The right and left hemisphere of the brain are actually fairly large pieces of real estate, even for a coarse EEG scalp electrode method, right? So telling left from right is not that technically difficult, and it's been done for decades. In our case, what we've done is to apply more recently developed multivariate approaches so that we could actually more precisely map not just left and right, but each of the positions around the circle, and even grids of positions we can do with MRI and with EEG activity. And I'd say part of the reason for that is that the visual system has got this convenient topographic organization that we can exploit with these kinds of methods. Now, by contrast, we haven't had much success in tracking, let's say, color representations using EEG activity. You can do that with MRI, which is more spatially resolved, but we can't do it yet with EEG, at least not during the sustained delay period. Turns out we can actually decode the color for about half a second after something is presented. We can kind of look at that pulse of activity and we can decode colors, but it doesn't seem to be a memory signal because it doesn't last the way the spatial signal does.
Can I follow on just quickly about how your electrode array is on the overly occipital lobe? So you said that you used 10, but the data you presented had 10 electrodes?
Actually, I think those data were, 30 electrodes. And they're actually over the entire scalp,
Okay.
not just in the back. And it turns out that the information, if we do a mutual information analysis of the electrodes to find which electrodes give us information about position, it's actually fairly spread out across the whole scalp. And so, I mean, that might make you think that the whole brain is representing this information, which MRI data suggests may be the case. But I'll just caution you that you can't really localize EEG signals very effectively. So it could be that it's all coming from the back of the brain, but it's just some of it's projecting to the front part of the head. So yeah, but if you look at visual evoked responses, like steady state flickering stimuli, you can also decode those stimuli if they're still on the screen. And if you look at that signal, it's very concentrated in the back of the head. So direct visual stimulation, back of the head. Memory seems to be more diffusely spread across the whole scalp.
What kind of individual differences do you get in this task? And is there any evidence that the ability to verbally label colors really accurately would help you?
Yeah, so you get a lot of individual differences. Interestingly, they're very stable. So if you test somebody and they've got a capacity of 3 and you bring them back a year later, they'll probably have a similar capacity. There's a lot of correlations there. You get a beautiful distribution of ability across people, and that distribution, as I mentioned earlier, is highly predictive of intellectual function in a lot of different domains. Now, labeling of colors is indeed quite beneficial for performance in these tasks, which is why we do everything we can to prevent people from using that strategy, because labeling is not the same thing as thinking. So you might have heard about the number 7 plus or minus 2, which is a commonly known number for the number of digits that people can report back on average. There's a really interesting study that was done a while back showing that Welsh children had lower digit spans than English children, which I think there was a lot of political opinions about at the time. But it turns out that the reason is that Welsh numbers take longer to pronounce. And once they ran the same subjects with English digits, they had the same digit spans. So in other words, digit spans and your ability to remember labels is really in a lot of ways limited more by how fast you can talk than by the number of ideas you can hold in mind at the same time. And this goes back to that earlier point I was making about individuated ideas. So if I'm remembering a phone number, 323-9740, well, if I'm repeating that back and forth to myself while I'm going to get the phone, we can question whether that's really 7 separate ideas in mind. We're really well-practiced talkers, and we can create motor loops out of speech that may not really be one separate idea for every number in the string. Therefore, I would argue that digit span is a limited and somewhat misleading way to measure the number of things that you can hold in mind.
I was just thinking if I could say that's eggplant and that's lavender and
Yeah.
that's, that I would be more accurate at your task and would be able to have an extra way of storing stuff.
Yeah,
Just visually.
I think that could work, right? I remember when I was doing my dissertation work, I was presenting people colors to remember as a control condition, and one of my subjects said, yeah, I realized that color looks exactly like the color of Captain Kirk's shirt. And this one is Nurse Chapel's, whatever. And so you can have very precise long-term memories of colors, and you could exploit those memories to have precise memories in these kinds of tasks. But now what you've done is to use a strategy that short circuits what we're actually trying to measure. So we're always trying to devise tasks that people cannot get around in that way.
Have you done studies of equally skilled, say, card players or bridge players, and for them is the capacity different?
Yeah.
Or is the precision of recall different?
So we haven't done those studies ourselves. We did do a study of memory for faces that were upright or upside down, because it's well known that people have amazing expertise at subtle face discriminations upright, and that goes out the window when you turn them upside down. Interestingly, you remember the same number of them, but you just have a much more precise memory of the ones that are upright. So now another classic set of studies that were done a long time ago with chess experts shows that grandmaster in chess, you show them a chessboard with a reasonable position on it, and they can reproduce it very accurately with a glance. But do they have better memory? Well, if you give them a random chessboard, they're the same as people that have never played chess before. So what they're doing is they are using their long-term memories of what chess positions are likely and how they are going to be set up, and they can exploit that to have a good memory in the same way that you can remember a story that makes sense way easier than you can remember a random list of words that don't make a story for you.
Just a follow-up question in this context. So is the memory recall for someone who's playing a game, so they have a sense of the sequence of moves, and let's say after the 16th move there's a certain board position. If that were to be presented in isolation, then the recall is equally effective.
Yeah, the chess expert can still look at that position and understand it. They can say, yeah, there's the pawn defense system over there, and they've got the bishops lined up with each other for this attack from the left side on the queen side, blah, blah, blah. They've got all sorts of ways of telling stories to themselves about why that current position makes sense. And so I think you would still expect to get very good memory from an expert chess player in that scenario.
Yeah, maybe you already touched a little bit about my question and answer. So I was interested if maybe you guys have already done it. So is there any activity or even studied food or any practices that will improve the memory or that will make the subjects better in remembering things?
Yeah. I'm surprised it took this long for that question to come up. So there's a lot of controversy about that question in the literature. There's high-profile papers that are out there that have claimed that if you do this, if you practice this task enough, that it's sort of like working out your legs. If you run a lot, your legs get stronger. If you think a lot in this way, your mind will get stronger. That's kind of the analogy that people are presenting, mostly in paid, in companies that are trying to make money from this brain training business, right? So you've probably heard of Lumosity, and you've heard of other companies that offer you their exercises that they say will keep your mind sharp. And what I'll say is that if you listen really closely to what Lumosity commercials say, they never say that. They never say that it will make you smarter, because they'll get sued. In fact, they were sued. They did have to pay a fine for accidentally saying that in some brochure that they had. All right, so they are very careful not to really make the claim that they make you believe that they made with their commercials. There are papers out there saying if you do this, you can increase fluid intelligence. If you do this, you can increase memory capacity. And honestly, they just have not fared very well in critical follow-ups and replications. They don't tend to replicate very well. So I'm cautiously skeptical about that stuff and don't think that there's a robust demonstration yet that this is possible. Now, the places where I think I have some more confidence that there's probably something there is exercise. So, your brain weighs 2% of your weight, and your brain uses 20% of your metabolic energy. Blood flow and glucose and all this stuff, it's really important for the function of your brain. So it kind of makes sense that if you're in aerobic shape, that you might do better thinking than if your brain is starved for oxygen. So exercise, there's some really great work from Art Kramer and colleagues at the University of Illinois showing that exercise seems to have a positive impact on a range of intellectual functions. And there the way I would portray it is that what you're doing is to allow yourself to reach your true potential instead of allowing it to go downhill because you're not providing your brain with the nutrients that it needs to operate properly. Likewise, if children are not fed a nourishing diet, they will do worse intellectually than if they are given food that is healthy for them. This is not necessarily to be thought of as an elixir for improving native intelligence, but it's a way to get people to perform up to their potential. So I think that it's kind of a nuanced question, right? Is there something that can improve brain function? Well, if you're depressing your brain function to start with, then yes. What if you're a healthy college student? Can you do brain training games and increase your intelligence? Now I'm more skeptical about whether that's possible. I mean, it might be, and nobody's found the way yet, but I don't believe the data that are out there yet.
From a rehabilitation standpoint, working with damaged brains, there are evidence-based practices for cognitive rehabilitation of memory. However, none of them have much to do with retraining memory. They have to do with getting good at using compensatory strategies to deal with the memory that you've lost. And a lot of those are attention, to handle working memory. The idea of using attentional strategies for working memory are the best, but the training doesn't generalize, I don't think, yet to anything. But there's some evidence that we can train some things, but only with compensatory strategies to help them make up for what's lost.
Yes, and I'm a firm believer that strategies are effective and that you can learn to handle a specific situation better. So, can you get better at a task by practicing a task? Yes, that is absolutely 100% known that you can do this. That's why all those kids are sitting at their pianos, right? And so I think that's what one of the key challenges is in the cognitive training literature, is to distinguish between practice effects and training effects that will generalize from the task that they practiced. And that's a really tough thing to do. It's not an easy experiment to design.
Quick question. So normal people got 3 things that they can remember in their working memory. What are some of the outliers? What are some of the best scores that anybody can do consistently 6 out of 6?
Yeah. Well, actually in Steve Luck's lab, there was a grad student that was there at the same time as Ed and Steve, and he could consistently get about 5 colors. But he probably did it using dirty little tricks. And so over the years, since '97, there's been refinements to the task. Like making sure to avoid color repetitions because people can exploit those, and making sure to have colors that are distinct enough that you don't confuse them, and all these other things. And now if you take the refined version of the task and you look at the thousands and thousands of subjects collected in our lab alone, nobody has ever gotten over 4. And for all we know, they got there with some little trick, you know? So it's interesting. One really important discovery in the last several years, again made by Kirsten, actually, was that these individual differences in capacity are not differences in the maximum number that each person can hold for the most part. What she discovered is that basically 90% of subjects have a max of 3. And what happens is that some subjects get to that maximum quite often, and some subjects fail to achieve that maximum on a much larger percentage of trials. So capacity limits, capacity differences, the ones that predict intelligence and stuff, are actually better thought of as differences in how often you achieve your potential than differences in what your potential is. There was only a very small subset of subjects that required a model of 4 items in memory to explain their data when you took into account guessing and stuff. But it's interesting to note that a person with 4 as a maximum is not necessarily the best scoring subject in the experiment, because if they don't get there often enough, they're not going to be better than somebody that gets 3 every time. So consistency of performance, like focus and consistency, seems to be a really critical part of this memory ability that we're measuring.
Variable scoring does have some.
Variable scoring seems to be a lot of the reasons why performance is not at its peak. Yeah.
Are there any individual differences that you guys have found that speak to what that inter-individual variability is coming from? Like, is it a nutrition thing? Is it an exercise thing? Is it an artist thing?
Yeah. I don't think we know the answer to that yet. Yeah. Yeah, I think this is another question where I really wish that we knew the cellular basis of this operation. You know, we really have a long way to go, I think, on that particular point. And so I could give you more qualitative correlational descriptions and stuff of the fact that high capacity subjects tend to have better attentional control. So if I'm asking you to, for example, if anybody did know, as far as I can tell, nobody in the room noticed the change in the people that were showing you the colors, right? Or maybe, oh, you did, but haven't you seen it before?
I haven't seen that, but I knew you were going to trick us somehow.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you're too savvy, you know. But one thing I like to say to people is, if you didn't notice that, it's because you had good attention. You were paying attention to the colors, and you were ignoring the stuff that wasn't important to you at that moment. High K subjects, subjects that have high memory capacity, they're good at ignoring the things that don't matter and zeroing in on the things that do matter. But now all I've given you is a correlated ability, right? I haven't really explained to you why they have that better attentional focus. But that's another discovery that's been made about qualitative differences between people that perform better and worse on those kinds of tasks.
All right, well, thank you very much.